Okay, welcome everyone to this new lecture series. It's really nice that you have taken the time to come, and many of you already have been present in previous Zoom lectures that are organized by Family Federation in the UK, but is open to everyone. So yeah, we're going to be covering starting from the Berlin Wall and the Providence. If you're interested in any previous lectures or lecture series that William has given, which cover earlier parts of the Providence, you can find them on the Family Federation UK website. I can post the link in the chat to that. But first of all, let's, if you can please join me in prayer. Heavenly Parent, we're now starting a new lecture series given by William Haynes. We're really grateful that we have this opportunity to gather and to be together even among brothers and sisters from all around Europe and even from the world. And we pray that you can speak to our hearts and teach us new things and inspire us to understand how we can continue the providence that you are working on and that you are desperately trying to achieve. We pray that you can be with all the brothers and sisters on this call today and that also more people can join. And yeah, we pray that you can use this opportunity to be close to us and to help us understand your heart and your will better. We pray that you can speak through William and also be with him. This we pray in all of our names and offer this prayer in my name, Sonia Reed, blessed and her family. Aju. And so next, please, let's welcome up William.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all again. And about 150 plus people signed up for the workshop. I don't think everybody's going to be here in the evenings, but it means that if you sign up, then you'll get sent a link to the lectures when they get posted online. So yeah, it's great to see you. Without further ado, I guess I should start. Okay, so tracing God's providence after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there we are. Just, I think quite a lot of, most of you I think know me, but just those of you who haven't been before, just a little bit about myself. That's my wife and I. We were blessed in 1982, Madison Square Gardens. And we have 4 children. These are old photographs. It's my oldest son and daughter-in-law, Christabel. And they have 2 children. That's one of them, Charlotte. And another one I haven't got a photograph of called Conrad. That's the second son, Jonathan, his wife, Irina. And third son, Alexander, and daughter, Elizabeth. And so at the moment anyway, some of us live together, Robert and his family, and Elizabeth and Ruth and myself, we live together in the same property, a 400-year-old house. Sometimes people ask me, basically, as I said, when I'm teaching, often I'm just making it up as I go along in a manner of speaking. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say, and often I just listen to myself teaching. And I don't expect you to agree with everything I say. In fact, if you do agree with everything I say, I'll be quite disappointed because, basically it's very ad hoc. And a lot of what I say is just to encourage you to think. And sometimes people say to me, well, what's God's point of view? Surely as a lecturer, you should be presenting God's point of view. And, Sonia said, well, hopefully God will speak through me. But when I think about what God's point of view is, it often reminds me, as Brigitte was mentioning, I gave this sermon yesterday. And part of that was I told this little story of, I think it's often called a Buddhist story, but quite a few different cultures have it, of the blind man and the elephant. And there was a ruler. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I can't remember now, he decided to do a little experiment. And he got an elephant and he got some blind men. And he asked these blind men to tell him what it was that they could feel and touch, because they couldn't see anything, obviously. And one of the blind men, he bumped into the trunk and he said, this is a hose pipe because water squirts out of it. Another one, he bumped into a leg and he said, this is like a tree because it's so thick, like a tree trunk. Another one bumped into the ear and as the ear flapped, he said, this is like a fan to keep me cool. Another one bumped into and came across the tail and he said, this must be a rope. And another one felt and bumped into the elephant's tummy and said, this elephant is like a wall. And for each of them, they argued about what the elephant was. It was a hosepipe, a fan, a wall, a tree, a rope. And the ruler, of course, laughed. And then the thing is, this is the nature of reality. Whenever we encounter reality, we only encounter it from our own point of view. Yeah. So how can we experience reality from God's point of view? How can we understand and know God's point of view? So everyone, we all have our own individual perspective, our own individual point of view, our own individual perception, our own individual experience of life and way of looking at things. That is inevitable. It can never be anything other than that. And at the same time, each of us is an individual expression of the divine. So in one sense, we can say each person is able to see things from their point of view, but also from God's point of view. But the reality is that all perspectives are relative. So each of these people thought that their perspective was the correct one, that what they encountered and described and defined was right. But in one sense, they were all right. But in the other sense, they were all wrong. And so how can we know what God's point of view in that sense is? So if all those blind men, instead of arguing with each other and saying, my point of view is right, what I found is right, I'm absolutely convinced that this is a tail or a tree trunk, if instead of that, they'd listened to each other and thought, well, that's really interesting. Your experience of this elephant is like this, and your experience of this elephant is like that. And if they'd listened to each other and try to put together all the different experiences and perceptions, then they may have come to an understanding of what an elephant really was like. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Each of them has a piece of the jigsaw, but none of them has all the pieces of the jigsaw. So what they need to do is to put together all the different pieces of the jigsaw, and then they can see the whole picture. And so that's how I understand God's point of view. God sees things from the perspectives of the whole. God sees everything. God is omniscient. God is omnipotent. God knows everything. So God can see everything from everybody's point of view. So if we want to understand what God's point of view in that sense is, then we need to listen to everybody else's point of view and then try to put together all the different pieces, and then we can get a more holistic perspective. Because I said all perspectives are relative. And there's a very important spiritual principle here. The second commandment says, you shall not make any image. Don't make any images of what is in heaven or on earth. Don't make an image. Why does it say that? It's because all images are relative. Any picture we make of God, or any statue we make of God, or anything you write about God, or any way in which you try to define God using language, is always going to be a relative perspective, because of the nature of reality. God is invisible. God is beyond time and space. God is inherently, fundamentally mysterious. We can never really get our head around God. God is beyond language. And so that means, that's why God said, don't make any images, because all images are relative. And the problem is that when people make an image, it means they're absolutizing that which is relative. And they're claiming my perspective is the absolute perspective when it's actually just a relative perspective. It's only a partial description of the whole. And so that's what idolatry is, when people raise up their own view of everything and claim their concept of God, their belief about God, their picture of God, their words they use to describe God is the absolute one. And that's why people get into so many conflicts, because they only see things from their own point of view. And we can see this going on a lot. People get into fights and arguments. And you can see this also within a family. If you have children fight, they get into arguments and over toys and all kinds of other things. And as a parent, one doesn't take sides. One tries to listen to each of the children and say, well, what happened? Tell me your side of the story. And then tell me your side of the story. And then listen to each other's side of the story, because often people misunderstand the other. They have certain assumptions about the reason why other people did what they did. And this leads to a lot of misunderstanding and then a lot of conflict. And so this is the meaning of this story then, the story of the blind man and the elephant. In order to be able to understand the whole picture of what's really going on, we need to listen to all these different points of view. and not assume that our point of view is the absolute or the right one. And of course, this is the nature of reality. Reality can never be encompassed in any particular concept or any particular narrative. It's all reality, just like God, is always bigger than anything we can possibly conceptualize and imagine. It's always good to remember that, to bear that in mind. Okay, so let's turn a little bit then, study a few passages in the principle about God's providence. I'm not going to go all the way back to Adam and Eve, but I'm going to go back a little bit. So these are some passages from the consummation of human history, which people don't often study or teach anymore. So the providence of reclaimed people began from lone individuals called by God. So, as Sonia said, I've been teaching a lot, and the first individual that was called by God, of course, to reclaim human beings, of course, is Abel. That didn't work out well. He was killed. Then God called Noah, but again, problems in Noah's family, which you can look at in my previous lectures, meant that didn't work out. That providence didn't work out. And so eventually God found Abraham. And from Abraham, then was a single individual from which God's providence expanded from the individual to the family, to society, to the nation, and today, as it says, has reached a worldwide level. So that's why Abraham and Sarah are called the parents of faith. Sometimes they say Abraham is the father of faith, but Jews call Abraham and Sarah the parents of faith. For some reason, a lot of spiritual traditions forget the women. Jews don't forget that. That's why all the patriarchs have matriarchs. They all have wives. They all have mothers. And, God said to Sarah, you're going to be the mother of many nations. So God's foundation progressively expands all this way. Individual, couples, families, society, nations, and today has reached a worldwide level, which is what we're going to be looking at in more detail. So the providence to separate Satan began with the clan society and continued through the stages of political and social development, feudalism, monarchy, and today democracy. So again, we looked at that in previous lectures. So coming back up much more to the present, our world is divided into two. Now you have to remember the divine principle then was formulated and written in the 1950s. Now I'm not sure if it was updated after that. New editions came out, I don't know if, anyway. The democratic world, which seeks to create societies on God's side, and the communist world, which has been establishing regimes on Satan's side. And that's basically where we're left off during the last workshop. And then people started asking me questions, and we had another 2-hour discussion after that. And a year ago, I said, well, okay, I'll teach another workshop, what's been going on since the collapse of communism. And I'm afraid it's a year late. So sometimes people are pacifists and think, well, there shouldn't be war, but reality is, according to principle, war is inevitable. If there were no wars or divisions in the fallen world, then the sovereignty of evil will continue forever and the world will never be restored. So reality is when you have a sovereignty of evil, so that doesn't just mean Satan from the spiritual world, it means tyranny, it means dictatorship, it means totalitarianism. If nobody resists that, then it will continue forever. But sometimes in resisting evil, resisting tyranny, resisting dictatorship, or trying to change totalitarian societies, sometimes this leads to conflict. Why is that? Because people who have power don't like to let go of the power that they have. They don't want to give up power, whether it's an individual, dictator, or king, or whether it's a political party or an oligarchy. They don't want to give up power. They don't want to give up the power to control other people's lives. They don't want to give up the power to control a society. They don't want to give up the power which enables them to become phenomenally rich and wealthy. And so sometimes the only way in which this power can be wrested from them is through conflict. And sometimes these conflicts lead to wars. Therefore, God has worked his providence to restore the heavenly sovereignty by degrees, not overnight, not in one go. It's taken many, many years. He sends prophets and saints to the fallen world to found religions and raise the level of morality, then hoping that through this religious transformation and change can also come about a peaceful social, political, and economic change as well. Sometimes it doesn't always work out like that, and religious people themselves get into wars and fights with each other. He establishes governments with higher standards of goodness, which come to oppose and destroy regimes with lower standards of goodness. To fulfill the providence of restoration, therefore, conflicts and wars are unavoidable. So it says God establishes governments with a higher standard of goodness. In reality, it's not God that does that. In reality, it's people that do that. But the people that do that are the people that respond to God's calling them through their conscience. As it says another verse or another line in the principle, it says, without the conscience, God's providence of restoration could never go forward. So God's providence of restoration goes forward to the extent that people listen to and follow their conscience. And sometimes this leads to them having to risk their life. Without that, God's providence doesn't go forward. Without that, governments with a higher standard of goodness are never established. Unless there are people who are willing to take a stand against evil and tyranny, because their conscience says, I cannot put up with this. I cannot tolerate this evil. I have to say something. I don't know how many of you know about this group called the White Rose during the Nazi time in Germany. Extraordinary group of students who felt they could not live with themselves unless they protested against Nazism, giving out leaflets. And of course, they were young students, but they couldn't live with themselves unless they did this. And of course, they're all arrested. And of course, they were all shot, executed. Where do you think they went to in the spiritual world? With higher standards of goodness come to oppose and destroy regimes with lower standards of goodness. To fulfill the providence of restoration, wars are inevitable. And that's a very sad reality. And wars conducted by good sovereignty to destroy an evil sovereignty are good, and they further the fulfillment of the providence of restoration. So this is a really important point here, is the wars are conducted by good sovereignty to destroy an evil sovereignty. It's not to destroy people, it's to destroy evil sovereignty. It's to bring about regime change in that sense. It's not to destroy a particular nation or race or religion. It's to change the sovereignty, change the form of governance. So the people who are living under this evil sovereignty can instead live under a good sovereignty. This is a really important point. It's not about, trying to destroy or eliminate people of a particular race or nationality. It's not the people who are evil. It's the sovereignty, the form of government, which is unjust, oppressive, and problematic, which needs to be changed. So what form does the final war between democracy and communism take? This is primarily a war of ideologies. And we saw this during what we call the Cold War, with basically a decision by the democratic world, after the establishment of the Iron Curtain. The policymakers in America and Britain particularly came up with a formula that said, this is an ideological conflict. We're not going to have a war with the Soviet Union. We're going to engage in an ideological conflict through things like the BBC, the Voice of America, through all kinds of ways to engage in ideological conflict with communism. And of course, our own spiritual community, through parents, initiated the VOC campaign for education, Causa, Washington Times. All these then were engaged in this ideological conflict to try and bring about, through education, regime change and the end of this evil sovereignty. But that's the interesting thing here. It says the final war. Well, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, have we seen any more wars? Yes, we have. So, okay, so what's been going on then since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end and the collapse of communism and the end of this ideological conflict? So although fallen history began under the sovereignty of Satan, God's providence has brought about a progressive transformation of the hearts of people as nurtures their original nature. So again, this is very progressive. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual transformation change, which sometimes takes years, usually takes decades, but more often centuries. nurture their original nature, which seeks goodness through religion, philosophy, and ethics. This inner nurturing is inspired groups which seek a just rule to separate from the prevailing evil. And whenever we look at these societies where there's tyranny, dictatorship, oppression, injustice, you can always, nearly always, find inspired groups who feel it shouldn't be like this. The way things are is not the way things ought to be, and it's possible to change things. And the first person who felt that was Abraham, which I looked at. If you look at the story of Abraham, he's the first person who felt the way things are is not the way things are supposed to be. They don't need to be like this. You can have good without evil. Evil is not necessary and certainly not inevitable. So this process of separation culminates in the establishment of two opposing powers on the global level. That's democracy and communism. These two sovereignties with contrary purposes can by no means peacefully coexist. As human history nears its consummation, they'll surely arrive at the point of intersection, colliding internally in the realm of ideology. This inner conflict may spur them to fight external wars with military forces, and we saw that in many places. And the conflict between the West and the USSR is usually through proxy wars in Africa and Latin America and sometimes in Europe. But at the conclusion of this conflict, Satan's sovereignty will perish forever, and heaven's sovereignty be re-established as the one eternal sovereignty of God. Today, we're at the very point of this intersection when these two worlds are confronting each other in the final battle. So we might say, and as I looked at in my last lecture series, the final battle then between the Soviet Union and the democratic and the Western world, NATO, the Western world, that came to a peaceful conclusion with a breakup of the Soviet, with the end of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the liberation of all the nations of Eastern Europe, which were able to become and start to establish liberal democracies and free markets. And hopefully that will never go back. But at the same time, that whole conflict has not been resolved in the Far East yet. We still have North Korea, which people often say is communist, but it's much more like Nazism, to be perfectly honest. It's much more like a Nazi regime than a communist regime. And of course, there's China, which is no longer formally communist, even though it's run by the Communist Party, but they've really abandoned Marxism-Leninism because they've adopted free market and capitalism, but with state control. And because they realized that communism kept them poor. And then, of course, you have, so that conflict is still going on, it's still alive, and it could be a military conflict, we don't know. But anyway, this is the thing that struck me. Satan's sovereignty will perish forever. But it's, when we look at the world since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we can see Satan is still pretty active. And so let's try and figure out what's going on here. So, whoopsie daisy, press the wrong buttons there. So this here is the fall of the Berlin Wall. It took place in 1989, 9/11, 1989. Of course, that's the 9th of November, 1989, the British way of counting. And then, of course, this was a cause of incredible celebration. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall then came the end of all kinds of conflicts between the West and the Soviet Union. The end of the conflicts in Afghanistan, Angola, the same year, overthrow of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. Of course, there's a riot, there's a Tiananmen Square protest in China, which turned out to be a tragedy and a disaster because they were crushed. I don't know how things might have developed if they hadn't been. It's very hard to know. The dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, breakup of the Soviet Union, potential rapprochement with North Korea. That's when Father went and met Kim Il-sung. So, and at the time, and I'm sure all of us, felt incredibly hopeful. As the end of communism, now we're going to have the beginnings of a peaceful democratic world. Someone called Francis Fukuyama wrote about the end of history, a book I think it was called The End of History, thinking now everyone's going to adopt liberal democracy and the free market's obviously far more successful. And there's a lot of that kind of, I would say, very naive kind of thinking going on at the time. But when we look at the world today, you wonder, well, why is it like this? How did things turn out to be like this? Well, in order to understand the way things are today, I actually need to look back. So when Father traveled around the world in the few years before, while he's still able to travel, delivering all the peace messages, when he started talking about peace, where did he start? Well, as Banks said, Adam and Eve. So then when Father started talking about world peace today, he started talking about Adam and Eve. I'm not going to go back and talk about Adam and Eve, but Winston Churchill said, the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. Because the longer you can look back, you can see the trends of history. You can see the cycles of history. You can see the direction in which history is going. And so it's possible then to anticipate how things are going to develop in the future. In other words, if things carry on like this, they'll probably develop in this way. Not inevitable, but it's a tendency. You see the tendency, okay, if it's developing like this, it'll probably develop like that. And so that's why Winston Churchill was able to predict a lot of things, because the further you can look back, the further you can look forward. And that's the nature of the prophets in the Old Testament. If things carry on like this, this is what's going to happen. It's not predestination, it's not inevitable. It's just if you can look back and see the trends and there's a certain logic to it, you can predict the future. So this is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He said, a person does not know the history of the last 3,000 years, wanders in the darkness of ignorance, unable to make sense of the reality around him. Sounds a bit extreme. Unless you know the last 3,000 years, then you don't know what's going on in the world today. It's a bit like opening a book, like War and Peace. It's a really thick volume. You open it, 2/3 of the way through and you start reading and you wonder, why are these people behaving the way they're behaving? Why are these people talking the way they're talking? And you can't understand what's going on because you don't know what went on in the previous 500 pages. So if you want to understand the conclusion of a novel, why it turned out like that, you've got to start at the beginning. So that's why Father always started with Adam and Eve. So if you want to understand what's been going on since the fall of the Berlin Wall, you actually need to look back, but not back to Adam and Eve, not even back 3,000 years, but we need to cast our mind back and look at the sort of how things have been developing basically over the last 1,000 years. And this is really important to understand history. This is George Orwell. He said the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And you can see that often tyrants do that. Today it's the woke who are doing this, trying to destroy and obliterate people's understanding of their own history, trying to revise it, rewrite it. Tyrants, totalitarian regimes, they always do that because they want to try to recreate people in their own image. So they have to destroy people's sense of identity, which grows out of their own understanding of their own history and their own literature. So let's look at this. And so when we look at the principle is basically a commentary upon the last 6,000 years. So sometimes people say, when did our spiritual community begin? 1953, whenever the HSA was established, or 1960, or whenever else the Family Federation was established, or the Holy Community was established. Now, I always say to people, our spiritual community started 4,000 years ago with Abraham, because that's why the whole of the principle is an analysis of God's providence from the time of Abraham. This is all part of our history. This is all part of our narrative, all part of our story, and all part of who we are. And without understanding that and inheriting that, we don't know who we are. And we lose our sense of identity. And if you want to preserve your sense of identity as an individual, as a family, as a community, as a religious, or as a nation, you need to understand your history, where you've come from, why things are the way they are, and where you're going to. So I said, I need to look back basically about the last 1,000 years of European history. Look at some other histories as well, but start off with Europe. So this is the map of Europe about 1,000 years ago. And you can see it's similar to the way it is today, but also different. You can see France was there. France is one of the oldest unitary states in Europe, and England. Basically, the two oldest unitary states in that sense have always existed. And then if we look at Spain, we can see most of Spain at that time was actually Muslim, because there's a huge Muslim empire, which was developing from Saudi Arabia, which came into Spain, conquered most of Spain. There was no Germany. There was the Holy Roman Empire, which included many different ethnic groups and half of Italy. There was also Sweden, which at that time was pretty powerful. Poland, Hungary, very large. Here we got Kiev and Rus, which of course comes up a lot in the newspapers today. This is the Byzantine Empire down here. This is after the fall of the Roman Empire. Then the Roman Empire continued in the east for another 1,000 years. In Byzantium, Constantinople was the headquarters, was the capital. And then from Constantinople, Christianity came to Kiev and Rus. So Kiev is somewhere around about here. And the Slavic people, they adopted Orthodox Christianity, different to Catholic Christianity. Again, as I mentioned last workshop or two back when I was talking about the Slavs, in terms of an ethnic group, the Slavs are the largest ethnic group in Europe. The second largest are the Germanic people, and I don't know who the third largest is. Anyway, so the Slavs are the largest, and so this is Kiev and Rus. And over here, other sort of tribes. It's here, these people here, they're called the Cumins, I think. Mostly they emigrated in Hungary. They got pushed over. And so this is Kiev and Rus here. And this is Lithuania, Teutonic Knights, and various tribes here, which became Christian very, very late, actually. So that was in the that was Europe then, basically in the 12th century. And they move on and have a look at it a bit later. Whoops. So this is 13th century. This is the time of Magna Carta in England. That's where basically a lot of English history starts from then. In terms of liberal democracy in England, basically starts formally, legally from that time. And France at that time is rather disunited. You can see here in Spain, the Christian kingdom of Castile is starting to push Muslims out of Spain. And Holy Roman Empire is rather fragmented this time. Kiev and Rus is here, lots of different tribes, and let's see what's going on down here. And you can see this here, Byzantium then has become squeezed, and this here is the beginnings of the Turks who moved in there to Turkey, and the sort of Ottoman Empire, which is developing there. Move on a little bit further, and here you can see what happened to Russia, Kiev and Rus. It disappeared. Well, what happened? This people here called the Golden Horde, or the Mongols. So Genghis Khan then, during this time, came from the east, from Mongolia, and they swept through the whole of what is now called Russia, and the Mongolian Empire then destroyed basically Kiev and Rus, and basically Russia continued to some extent up here in the kingdom of the Republic of Novgorod. But this whole area then, they swept in the Mongols, and they settled, and the whole of this area here was settled by Mongols. Now that time there, Lithuania expanded, became a very large area here. So nowadays people look a lot at Ukraine. So modern day Ukraine is sort of this area here. Okay. And see Hungary, Poland then, it's an unusual shape here, expanded as well, all the way down to the Black Sea. These, again, occupying, conquering these different kind of kingdoms here. Holy Roman Empire is fragmenting because of the conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Catholic Church over the investiture controversy. And you can see here the Ottoman Empire then is occupied, Byzantium fell. Ottoman Empire then has crossed over the Bosphorus and starting to move into Europe. And we can see here Spain and Castile, they've driven out the Muslims. They also expelled all the Jews as well. France then is a unitary state again. Holy Roman Empire, as I said, is fragmented into lots of different principalities and becoming very, very weak as a political and military power. This means that Poland and Lithuania formed a commonwealth, a very powerful space here, occupying this whole area here. Ottoman Empire then, it expanded into Europe, occupying Greece, what's now Bulgaria, what's now Romania, and getting as far as Vienna at one point. That's the Ottoman Empire, this whole area here. And also expanding into this area here, which is now the Crimea, the Crimean Khanate. So the Golden Horde, so Russia started to fragment and break up into these different parts of the Mongolian Empire. They got different kind of khanates here, and the Crimea here. And a lot of these now, this one here would now be called Tatarstan in Russia. So within Russia, there's still these Muslim republics, the sort of legacy of the Mongolian conquest of Russia. But Russia then, it starts to expand. It doesn't expand from Kiev, this expands from Moscow. So again, I looked a bit at Russian history. After the destruction of Kiev, then the capital of that area was in Vladimir, started to revolve. And then the person, I can't remember his full name, Ivan Moneybags is his nickname. He was able to bribe the Mongolians to give him the power to make Moscow the capital, basically. I've oversimplified it. And so Moscow then became this capital, and Moscow then started to expand. So basically Russia is an expansion of Moscow. Muscovy used to be called. And the beginnings of that regime in Moscow were kind of very problematic, because a lot of it was about power and force. And yeah, so you can see that's how things are developing there. And then, where are we here? So this is the 16th century, after the Reformation. You can see again the incredible fragmentation here, what used to be called the Holy Roman Empire, all these wars that were going on here. Russia then has started to push back against the Mongols and starting to move east. And gradually then, over the next few hundred years, Russia gradually rolls back the Mongolian Empire, and gradually it moves through Siberia until it reaches the Pacific. It's also trying to push south. So this has always been an issue for Russia. Russia is, even though it's the largest country in the world today, and the largest ethnic group within Europe, it never had a warm sea port. And so that was why the big push by Peter the Great defeated the Swedes, was able to conquer and establish St. Petersburg in the Baltic. But again, that was often frozen during always frozen during the winter. So Russia was always concerned about having a warm sea port. And that's why Peter the Great said, well, we have to move south to gain access to the Black Sea. At this time, it was all part of the Ottoman Empire. And then Poland then, still a huge country there. And this is Hungary, huge. Well, no, it's not actually a country, it's part of the Ottoman Empire. And Spain then is completely Spanish. They've driven out all the Muslims, driven out all the Jews, ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. Italy, as you see, is fragmented into the different Italian states. And not much different here. And then here we can see this is in the 18th century. This is just before French Revolution, which obviously it took place here. The Russian Empire then has expanded further south. So Catherine the Great, about 300 years ago, her armies, they were able to conquer the Crimea, and also this whole area now called Ukraine. Well, most of it, I think. Some of it's still here in what's now Poland. And so this then was incredibly important for Russia, to establish a warm sea port here in Sevastopol, and to be able to control this area here, to have access through the Bosphorus to the Mediterranean. And so this is incredibly important for trade. If you don't have access to the sea, it's very hard to trade. You just got the rivers, but the mouth to the rivers were controlled by foreign powers. So for Russia, it's always a huge importance to be able to secure a warm seaport. Then you have here, as I said, the French Revolution. Napoleon invaded, conquered most of Europe, went as far as Moscow. The Russians basically drove Napoleon back out again, and the Russian armies went as far as Paris. And when Napoleon occupied Germany, this was well, not Germany, the fought with all these little principalities, a huge shock for the Germanic people. And then Bismarck decided we can't let that ever happen again. We need to establish a unified nation, unified Germany. So France cannot do this to us again and humiliate us like this again. And that's what's going on there. And also the beginnings of the retreat of the Ottoman Empire starts to get rather stagnant. And you got various wars that take place here. And then things go on. The end of so Napoleonic Wars, Europe's divided up. Then it's the end of the First World War. The map looks very similar to the way it does today. You've got Portugal, Britain became Britain became United Kingdom became a unitary state in the beginning of the 18th century. But Poland, not as big as it was. You got Romania. You can see the Ottomans got pushed out, and so Romania, Bulgaria came into existence. Yugoslavia. So this is in 1918. So this is after the First World War. The Constitution, the Conference of Versailles, decided, okay, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottomans, they were lost. So the victorious powers then divided up. Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into bits by the Conference of Versailles. And so Austria then remained as became a small country, Hungary quite a small country. Then Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia came into existence. All these countries came into existence. Czechoslovakia came into existence. Italy, now a unitary state, developed during the 19th century. And the Ottoman Empire was broken up as well. Greece became independent in the 19th century. Belgium was put together. And so this is basically how the map looked in 1918. Not the same as it is today, but that's how it looked then. And then after the Second World War and Europe in 2001, this is how the map looks pretty much today. So I'm going to look into this in more detail after the break. So here we got Russia, the breakup of the Soviet Union in 2001, well, in 1992. So Ukraine finally comes into existence as an independent unitary state. It was a state for about 3 years between 1917 and 1920, when it became incorporated into the Soviet Union. But Ukraine came into existence then. Poland. I forgot to mention, there's a point here. Yeah, okay, I forgot, this is an important point. The Russian Empire then carried on expanding west. And then you can see here, this was what was called Poland, but Russians invaded Poland and said the Polish people don't exist as a nation. Because, as I said, going back, these are they're all Slavs. And so in the Russian mentality, all Slavs really are Russians. Anyways, it's a complicated history. And so they said Poland doesn't exist. So for a while, Poland didn't exist as a country. Then it came back again. Well, this is basically how it is today. You've got Poland. Germany is smaller than it was. You lose a war, you lose land, territory. There's a place up here, Kaliningrad. It used to be Königsberg. It used to be German for centuries. That's now a part of Russia. And then the Baltic states came into existence after the fall of the Soviet Union. And, Belarus, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria. So this is basically how the map looks today. So you can see how things have changed a lot over the last 1,000 years. And what we're going to look at then after the break is this sort of world of empires and understand what was going on there. Okay, so this is how things developed really over the last 1,000 years, but oversimplified, of course, within Europe. And you can see how, the borders change. There are nations that exist that don't necessarily have their own state. But they're still a nation, they're still a people, and often they struggle to achieve statehood. And one of the largest nations that doesn't have its own state today is the Kurdish people. Huge number of people there, but they never managed to get their own state after the end of the First World War. So if we look then at the before the First World War, we see basically it was a world of empires. You can see these vast different empires here. The vast Russian Empire was huge, the largest single continuous empire in the world in terms of land. There's the Chinese Empire, French Empire, British Empire, which is bits and pieces all over the place here. In India, of course, there's the Ottoman Empire, Spanish, Belgian empires, and so it's a world of empires, basically. Nowadays, the world is a world mostly of nations, but 100 years ago, it was a world of empires. And just look at these a little bit. So the first of these large European empires was the Portuguese and Spanish empires, which were very large. They basically disintegrated or fell apart, or these different countries became independent a long time before the First World War, during the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But most European countries had their own empire. This is the Portuguese Empire. Portugal had a large empire, not just in South America, but also here in parts of Africa. The Portuguese were the first European nation to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, taking slaves from West Africa to what's now called Brazil. And in terms of volume, they transported more slaves than anybody else. And again, you can see how these countries, part of the Portuguese Empire, became independent mostly around 1975. That's because up until that time, Portugal was a dictatorship. When it stopped being a dictatorship, the dictatorship was overthrown. These countries became independent. So they had a very troubled history. Look at Angola, Mozambique, very, very troubled history since independence. This is the Dutch Empire, mostly this area here in Indonesia, which was conquered by Japan during the Second World War. Then after the Second World War, the Dutch tried to reclaim their empire in Indonesia. And it was a very bloody kind of war there for independence by the people of Indonesia. This was the Belgian Empire. The Congo is probably the worst of all the European empires, West European empires, in terms of the way that the country was treated. And till today, it suffers from basically the personal rule of the King of Belgium, who treated it as his own personal private property and source of income, and never established a properly functioning government or society there. That's why it's still got huge problems till today. German Empire. Germany is basically a land, European power, but also it also wanted to have its own place in the sun. And so you can see these countries here became part of the German Empire. Namibia, Tanganyika as it was called then, Cameroon, and some various islands over here in the Pacific. And then this is the French Empire, which is very large, mostly here in West Africa. Algeria, Chad, all these countries here, the desert, Niger, but also a very large empire here in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and also Madagascar. And it's always very interesting, I find, to go and travel to these countries and to see what is the legacy. And when you go to different countries that are ruled by different European powers, you find the legacy is very different. And even within an empire, the legacy is very different. So, for example, the German Empire, here in East Africa, they established good education, they established good schools, good educational system and everything. It went very well. Whereas here in Namibia, they tried to exterminate the Africans who were living in Namibia. Basically, it's sort of early genocide. If you look in France, again, the very bitter kind of situation here in North Africa to get independence, Algeria. And again, I was traveling here a few years ago. I went to Cambodia, which was French. And it was interesting being there. And then looking at the map and trying to think about, okay, what happened after these countries became independent from France? Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, they all became communists. They were all taken over by communists. And I thought, why was that? Well, because the people who became the intellectuals from these countries, they went to study in Paris. When they studied in Paris, they encountered Marxist left-wing ideas. They became communists. So when they went back to Indochina, fighting for independence, they established communist regimes afterwards, which were awful. Whereas these countries here, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Burma, they were all British. And their outcome was very different. This is the British Empire. This was, you probably know, it was the largest empire in terms of geography and number of people who were on the part of the British Empire. This was the second British Empire. First one was this bit here, North America. They became independent. It's kind of interesting, there's this, there's 12 colonies or 13 colonies here on the east coast of America, established in the sort of 17th century. They became independent. They fought for independence in the 18th century. And then afterwards, Britain felt, oh, we lost our empire. So I thought, well, okay, what went wrong? Did we get anything wrong here? Was anything our mistake? So they set up a royal commission and they realized, okay, if we'd handled the American colonists, who were all British, if we'd handled them differently, then maybe they wouldn't have fought a war of independence. So when they wanted to have self-government, we should have given them self-government. When they wanted to have no taxation without representation, we should have given them representation, because all they were demanding was that they should be able to be governed according to English law and English principles. Anyway, so when other countries then demanded to have more independence, then Britain said, okay, you can have it. And so gradually when the Canadians wanted a bit more independence, then they were given their own parliament, Australia, New Zealand, all these countries. And so that's why many of them still connected to Britain through what we call the Commonwealth. And 15 or 16 are still, except the Queen as a head of state. Okay, it was a huge empire. You look at the legacy here. Most of these countries are liberal democracies. India is the largest democracy in the world. A lot of these other countries, they're also democracies. So that's the sort of legacy thing here, along with Malaysia and Thailand. Then if those are the world empires. Now, if you look at the European empires, there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 1914. This is how this part of Europe looked. A huge empire. We look at it, these are the countries which are part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the past, either these countries or parts of these countries. So you can see it's incredibly complicated. It was called KNK, had two centers, Vienna and Budapest, and two crowns, and included this area here. And this area here was basically part of the Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottomans retreated, then Austria-Hungary wanted to move further south. The Ottomans were moving out, getting pushed out, became Turkey, and the Austro-Hungarians wanted to move south. And then this is where everything went wrong, because Serbia is a Slavic country, not Germanic. And so Russia had interests here. And so when the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo, Austrians started to move into this area, which is predominantly Slav, and the Russians were mobilized. That led to the First World War. You can see it's incredibly diverse. And this is the level of diversity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These are the different ethnic groups, you might say, or national groups. So there's one empire with all these different ethnic groups, the Hungarians, the Austrians, Germans here, this part here, these are the Bohemians, it used to be called. And these here are the Poles, you know, it's almost as far as Krakow. Here you've got Transylvania, it's now called Moldova, the Romanians, and all kinds of people, Slovenes. It's incredibly complicated. I know almost nothing about this history other than it was incredibly complicated. But even within these areas, you can see these smaller ethnic groups. And so certainly in the past, I think in some places today in the present, you travel through some of these countries and you find there are towns, which it might be, certainly in the past, it was Hungary, but you'll find a town where the people were not Hungarian. They spoke a different language, and they had their own schools, their own education within their own language. And it's the same here and all over the place. A lot of these things changed during the 20th century, because with the rise of nationalism, people wanted to have their own nation state. And of course, within their own nation state, they wanted to have people of their own nationality only. And so this led to ethnic cleansing, which took place, as we know, continued to take place in Yugoslavia. It's again very, very complicated ethnically. It's not just an empire of all the same people, very, very complicated. So when it was broken up at the end of the First World War, it was into these constituent parts here. The lines were not exact. Living within each of these countries were large ethnic groups from other ethnic groups, you might say. This then is the Russian Empire in 1914. This is how it expanded. As I said, it started here in Moscow. It's called Muscovy. And this is, it started going, expanding east and also north, and ran up against the Finns who are here, who are not Slavs, and the people in the Baltics who are also not Slavs. And then it says here acquisitions. It gives the impression they were, I don't know why it has acquisitions. It's not that they were purchased. Some of them were purchased, I think. Some came by treaty, but some just by conquest. And so Russia then started off here and started to expand and acquire different territories here. As I said, this is Catherine the Great moving down into here, the Crimea, reoccupying Kiev, which was then part of Poland, Lithuania, moving into this area here, and then expanding down into here and continuing to move east until it could find a warm seaport somewhere over here, Vladivostok. Briefly had one over here, Port Arthur. Oh, there it is. And then acquired these territories here very late from Japan. And some of these ones from China by treaty. There are lots of wars here between the Chinese and the Russians. And expanded here, and then moved down into Central Asia. So again, these are all Turkic, Mongolian people, the old Khans here in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all this area here, predominantly Muslim. Azerbaijan's entirely Muslim. And also moving down here to the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, running up against Turkey here. So this is then the expansion of the Russian Empire. And basically, it's an empire. Now we call it Russia, but basically it's an empire. And this is the decline of the Ottoman Empire in 1774. This is the extent of the Ottoman Empire, the whole most of North Africa, all the way up here as far as Austria. Almost got to Vienna, conquered Vienna. Well, this whole area here, which later became part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then by 1914, this was area here, this yellowish bit here, the Ottoman Empire. These countries here achieved independence in the 19th century, or after Then this is the Chinese Empire, which I don't know very much about. Whoops, gone back. So this is China, the Han people, and then gradually they're moving east. And some of these countries then, these areas or countries, I don't know how to call them really, were independent up until 1911. Gradually started to become conquered by China, going from Beijing here, moving that way. This here was Chinese, then it was transferred to Russia by treaty. This here area, Tuva, also transferred to Russia by treaty, and here also transferred to Russia by treaty. Korea this time is more or less under Japanese dominion at this time. So that's the Chinese Empire, and also at some point they control parts of Burma as well. Okay, so that's empires, and that was the way the world was in 1914, 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, the world was a world of empires. Okay, is it supposed to be like that? What is the world supposed to be like? So history then is a history of restorations, we know, and that involves the end of empires. So it's a history of the providence of restoration. It says in the principle, battles over property, territory, and people have continued without interruption, expanding their scope in step with the progress of human society. The scale of these struggles has broadened from the family level to the level of, sometimes it's still on the family level, like mafia families, the level of tribe, society, nation, and world, until today, when the democratic world and the communist world confront each other in a final conflict. So according to the principle, as Father understood the providence and up to the 1950s, this conflict between the democratic and communist world was supposed to be the final conflict. So in these last days of human history, heavenly laws descended upon the earth in the name of democracy. So that's an important point. Through democracy, this is the way in which heavenly law is established. So what does that mean? Who does, in a democratic society, who decides what the law is? It's decided by in Parliament or Congress. So people then are engaged and taking responsibility for the kind of society which they're going to create, which is expressed in a legal constitution. And so it's not that it's not something imposed by God. It's something that people of good conscience democratically create themselves together with, as I said, God's providence. So democracy then is very important for the establishment of heavenly laws. Not one person, I'm bringing the law and you all got to follow it. It's not a dictatorship. It's not like that at all. So bringing an end to the long phase of history, which people sought to attain happiness by seizing property, land, and people. So instead of stealing things, you actually have a legal process through which you have to go, the rule of law. And the rule of law is there to protect property. It's there to protect land from being seized by criminals or the state. The law is there to protect property and people from the state and people. So instead of the king, you know, in the olden days, if you annoyed the king could have you arrested and put in prison and even had your head chopped off. In England, this stopped in 1215, where it was declared that nobody could be put in prison unless he was found to be guilty of breaking the law. So just because you don't like this person, just because this person's annoyed you, just because this person said, I don't like you, Mr. King, that's not a reason for having this person arrested and put in prison. They have to break the law. But then who decides whether this person has broken the law or not? Not the king, not the king's representatives, not the judges, but a jury of ordinary people, of the person who's been accused of a crime. That person's peers or that person's equals is there to hear and decide whether this person's innocent or guilty, whether this person broke the law or not. That's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah. You can't just seize someone's property or land or put them in prison just because you don't like them or because you want what they've got. There's a law is there to protect that, heavenly law. And that comes about through the democratic process, which started, particularly a liberal democracy started in England and then spread around the world. And as I said, Magna Carta, which we looked at a workshop or two ago, was an important part of that. Now, this is interesting. At the conclusion of World War I, the defeated nations gave up their colonies. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, all these countries which were defeated, apart from Russia, gave up their colonies. At the end of World War II, the victors voluntarily liberated their colonies. That's a very generous way of saying it, voluntarily. actually, some countries were voluntarily got their independence, but for some of these colonies, they had to fight a very bitter war of independence, especially like in Algeria, also in some countries in East Africa. And, you know, the way that it's really a stain upon the European conscience and soul and history, the fact that colonies weren't voluntarily given their freedom when they asked for it and provided them with material aid. Yeah, there's been quite a lot of material aid there, NGOs and things. And in recent years, the great powers have invited weak and tiny nations, some smaller than one of their own cities, to become member states of the United Nations, giving them equal rights and status in the Brotherhood of Nations. So the whole Providence then, according to the principles, will be moving away from empire to independent nations. Yeah, a Brotherhood of Nations, not towards one vast superstate, but towards independent nations, each of which is respected as being having equal value, in the same way that every individual has equal value, every nation should have equal value. That's what it says in the principle. So I'm always like to go and trace these things from the Bible as well, as you know. So from a biblical point of view, how are things supposed to be? So, like all good history, we go back to the flood. And the flood, as we know from the principle and also from the Bible itself, was a new start, a new beginning. Yeah, God was really upset. And the Bible says it broke God's heart when he saw violence. Several times it says violence, violence, violence. It's a violence when people are getting raped, robbed, murdered, raped, and robbed. It's that which broke God's heart and caused God to be heartbroken and to be grief-stricken. And it's that which was according to the Bible, that was the reason for the flood, to have a new start, a new beginning. Anyway, so what was this new start and new beginning supposed to be like? Well, this is how the Bible goes. The sons of Japheth, and it describes and lists all the sons, the whole genealogy and the lineage of Japheth, who's one of the three sons of Moses, of Noah, is named. From these maritime peoples, the sons of Japheth, it names them all. From these maritime peoples spread out into the territories by their clans, within their nations, each with its own language. So each of the sons of Japheth formed a clan and a nation, and each of these nations had their own language. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans and languages, in their territories and nations. So again, all the sons of Ham are listed. Each of these sons of Ham went on to form their own clan, their own nation, and each nation had its own language and its own territory, its own area in which it lived. These are the sons of Shem, by their clans and their languages in their territories and nations. So all the sons of Shem that are listed in the Bible, each of them went on to have their own clan, family, clan, tribe, nation, land, territory, and their own language. So that's very interesting. And these are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations, from these nations spread out over the earth after the flood. Okay, so this is the new start, not a single people with a single language and a single government. It's actually 70 different nations. There's a pluralism of nationalities, a pluralism of languages and of cultures. And Jonathan Sacks, he added them all up. And he said there are about 70 nations and 70 languages there that came about from the family of Noah. So the biblical understanding, the Jewish understanding is that every nation then is individual, unique and special, and has its own culture, which expresses its own traditions, its own custom, and God in a particular way. And every language then is a different way of perceiving the nature of reality. Those of you who are not English probably can speak more than one language fluently. Now, you know that when you think in one language and the world looks in a particular way, when you speak to people in one language, you communicate with them in a particular way. When you look at the world through another language, the world looks slightly different. When you communicate with someone using a different language, the relationship is different. you know, as we say, sometimes we can't find words in one language to express what we can in another language. That's why every translation is always an interpretation. No translation can be a perfect translation because every language has its own separate vocabulary, its separate kind of grammar, its separate traditions, and every word has all kinds of nuances and baggage that goes along with it, which is an expression of the social relationships of the people that speak that language and the way in which the people who speak that language look at the world in which they're living. And so you find every language has unique words which are untranslatable into other languages. Father said that about Korean, but I can say that about English. Japanese people can say that about Japanese. Germans will say that about German. You know, the German wants to say something, they just make a new word to describe what it is they want to say. So every language is different then. And as I said, well, it's like the elephant story. Actually, if you look at the world through the eyes of different languages, you can see the world differently. And so that's why it's people who speak more than one language, and each language is an embodiment of a certain kind of culture, is able to look at the world through a variety of different lenses or eyes and see the world differently, and often come up with very creative solutions to problems. That's why immigrants are often the most creative people, because they go to a country and everybody in that country speaks one language and sees everything in one way. But an immigrant comes with a different way of looking at the same problem, a different way of vocalizing, a different way of describing it, and will often come up with a different kind of solution to that problem. And often that's why they're the greatest entrepreneurs and inventors. Yeah, that's the way it is. That's why America's the way it is. Yeah, so that's why, so you have to think, okay, from the biblical point of view, this is God's vision, is a world of a plurality of nationalities, languages, and cultures, where people can listen to each other and they can learn from each other. Listen to each other and learn from each other and experience something which is different. To be honest, when I went with my children, we went on holiday to Germany. I thought it'd be great, let's try some German food. Where did my children want to go to eat? McDonald's. I said, you can go to McDonald's in England, in London. Oh no, we just want to eat McDonald's. But you know, most people then when they grow up, they realize actually it's really nice to go to a different country, different food, different language, different things, and you become enriched by that difference. And it's only through that kind of conversation, that kind of between differences, that you can become enriched, you can grow, and you can learn. Yeah, if everybody sees things in the same way, there's nothing new to learn. But when you meet someone who studies something different to what you've read, and who's experienced different things to what you've experienced, you can actually have an incredibly enriching conversation. So that was the biblical understanding of God's vision, is to have a world of plurality, where people respect each other and learn from each other and talk to each other in conversation. That was the vision of after the flood. And then, okay, so how is it going to be a united world then? So it's not a unity of language, not a unity of belief, not a unity of food or of ways of wearing clothes or anything like that. There's just going to be common laws. Laws that every human being would be expected to observe. And so that's called the covenant that God made with Noah and his descendants. It's a universal covenant. And it contains 7 laws that applied to every single human being. Everyone. The first is not to worship idols. So I looked at the meaning of that before. When you worship idols, you end up becoming incredibly self-centered, basically, nationalistic, and you think you're right and everybody else is wrong. You should worship the invisible God that created the heavens and the earth and who's a parent to every single human being, as opposed to an idol which is relative, and every tribe would have their own idols, and then that leads to those kind of religious wars. Second law is not to curse God, not to blaspheme, but to treat God with respect. God is the creator. You know, you have to worship God, treat God with respect, and honor God's name. Thirdly, not to commit murder, because every single human being is in the image of God. When you're murdering somebody, you're murdering the image of God. You're defining God's image. Every single human being is a son or daughter of God. Every single human being belongs to God. So nobody has the right to murder another human being. Fourth law, which is for everybody, not to commit adultery or sexual immorality, which is to protect the second blessing. This is to protect the first blessing, mind-body unity. Can't fulfill the first blessing if you're dead. Not to commit adultery is to protect the second blessing. Not to steal, to protect the third blessing. So, you know, people have the right to own something that belongs to them. You don't have the right to steal it. You can buy it, or they can give it to you. Sixth one, not to eat the flesh torn from a living animal. So again, that's connected to the relationship with the becoming Lord of creation. Sometimes people, before the days of fridges, if they wanted to keep meat fresh, they would just chop off the leg of an animal and then bind it up, and the animal would run around on 3 legs while they roasted 1 leg. And then a week later, they'd cut off another leg. And so that's how they kept the meat fresh, by treating an animal like that. So God said, no, you cannot treat animals like that. You have to. So this is the beginning of what we call animal rights. You think animal rights started with, what's his name? Somebody's singer. No, animal rights started here. You have to respect animals, treat them well. That's why it says in the Bible, before you go and have breakfast, you have to make sure you feed your cat. It doesn't say cat, it says cows. And then the 7th law, which again is universal for everybody, is to establish courts of justice. Because justice is really important. Because without justice, you get conflict and unresolved problems. And if people's problems aren't resolved and there's no justice, then people resort to violence. And God hates violence. There has to be justice to make sure that people who commit crimes are, get what they deserve. So these laws then are universal. But also there's the idea of the universal for everybody, but there's also the particular. So within this framework, every nation can have its own laws, its own traditions, its own customs and ways of life. So that's why you go to different countries, they have their own laws, and you have to observe the laws in that particular country. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So this is a biblical vision then of unity and diversity. So within this framework of universal laws, there's a diversity of ways of life, forms of living, cultures, etc., etc. Unity and diversity. That's a biblical vision. Again, I looked at this before. So when we look then at what comes next in the Bible, again, I looked at this story in one of the other workshops. It's really important to understand the age of empire and the breakup of empire. So this is the Tower of Babel. Now, the whole land had one language and a common purpose. As people moved east, they found a plain and settled there. They said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to heaven, so we make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the earth. But the Lord God came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them over all the earth, and they stopped building a city. That is why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So there are many different ways to read this story and to interpret this story. But basically, the Bible, as I mentioned in previous workshops, is a work of political philosophy. It's not scripture, it's not religious scripture. We think, oh, it's religious scripture, it's the word of God. Okay, that's how we see it. But in reality, it's a work of political philosophy. The whole biblical project is, how can we create a good society? We call it the King of Heaven. Jews call it Canaan. How can we create a peaceful and just society? So the whole of the biblical tradition is all about how can we create a peaceful and just world and society. It's about political philosophy, and this is a really important part of that. So you might wonder, well, is there any history? Is this just a story, or is there any evidence for it? Well, this is Peter Bruegel, I think he's from Belgium. He painted this painting, the Tower of Babel. And if you go back to modern day Iraq, you can find this is the great ziggurat of Ur, which is where Abraham came from. Built about 4,000 years ago. And originally it was 7 stories high. This is all that's left of it, just these first story or 2. But originally it's 7 stories high. It's incredibly high. That basically is where the story of Babel comes from. And when we look at this story in a bit more detail, wonder, well, okay, who was doing this Babel building? So Cush, who is one of Ham's sons, I think it was, also had Nimrod. This is from Genesis. He was the first great warrior on earth. So a warrior means he was a fighter, wanted to go around conquering people. He was a great hunter before God. Doesn't mean he worshiped God, but there's different meanings of that. There's a saying like Nimrod, a great hunter before God. His kingdom got its start with Babel. That's where he started, become the king of Babel. Then Erech, then Akkad, and Calneh in the country of Shinar, which is the plain of Shinar where the Tower of Babel was built. And there he went up to Ashur and built Nineveh and Rehoboth, Calah and Rezin, between Nineveh and the great city of Calah. So what he's doing here, he's a king of Babel, but then he's invading and conquering other neighboring towns and cities, and he's creating an empire. He's the first empire builder. And we saw one of these cities here was called Akkad. And so this then is one of the very first empires. It was called the Acadian Empire, the first empire. And one of those great rulers was Sargon. You can find this in the British Museum. This is the land here. And this is some of the things that were about it. Some of the things that are still found on the cuneiform tablets, some of the sayings. The Sargon, the king of the world, the conqueror of Elam and Parashum. So Sargon, then, he saw himself as the king of the world, as an emperor in that sense. This is over 4,000 years ago, before the time of Abraham. Sargon had neither rival nor equal. His splendor over the lands, it diffused, spread over all the lands. He crossed the sea in the east. In the 11th year, he conquered the western land to his farthest point. He brought it under one authority. He set up his statues there. Is that a new thing? I mean, that's what Stalin, Lenin, Saddam Hussein, Kim Il-sung, they all set up their statues. Same kind of, this is a tradition of this satanic tradition, really. He set up statues there and ferried the West booty across on barges. In other words, he's exploiting all these peoples that he conquered and transferring all the money to him, just like Rome conquered Egypt, so he could take all the grain from Egypt to feed the people in Rome. He stationed his court officials at intervals of 5 double hours, don't know what that means, and ruled in unity the tribes of the lands. So this is the most influential empire. It established what we call the hexadecimal system. Our calendar comes from there. And the idea of 7 days in a week and all these things, they all come from the Acadians, actually. And so Sargon then was a model for rulers for 2,000 years. You can see that was over 2,000, that was 4,000 years ago. So you can see there a lot of these elements about Sargon, you can see them replicated in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries still. And then this came a bit later, Sargon II, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. So the population of the 4 quarters of the world with strange tongues and incomparable speech, which I had taken as booty. In other words, he conquered all these nations, and I caused them to accept a single voice. In other words, he imposed a single language upon all these peoples that he conquered. And again, that's very, very common. You know, those of you who are growing up in the English-speaking world, you might wonder, well, why we're speaking English? Well, we're not English. Well, because when the British conquered lots of parts of the world, we decided everybody there should be educated and learn how to speak English. And you might wonder, well, okay, That's what people do when they have an empire. You impose a single language, a single voice to create a single culture. That's the way it's always been. And this is kind of the problems which are going on, you know, even if you look today in the Ukraine. In Ukraine, there's a whole language conflict there between the Ukrainian language and Russian language, Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers, and same going in the Baltics, same going on through much of Europe and much of the world. That's the way it works. So that's what's going on here, imposing a single language upon the world. And then again, a bit later on, Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, said, "Made the totality of all people speak one speech." So this is imperialism. This is the nature of imperialism. You make the many become one. One ruler, one language, one law, one culture, one myth. And so one of the ways in which you make these people you conquered your people is you would impose your myth upon them. You would impose your religion upon them, your language upon them. So they lost their own sense of identity, their own history, their own language, their own culture, and they then became the same people as your people, making the other become like me. So this is connected then to universalism, one correct ideology, and incredibly conformist and inherently totalitarian. You force them to become us. And you can see this, the Roman Empire, China, Japan, Egypt. Christianity is like that. You try to impose one religion and all kinds of other culture that goes along with that. Islam is the same way of trying to impose Arabic and a certain way of life upon everybody, and getting people to separate from their previous history and identity. Communism, of course, is like that, fascism as well. And also the sort of modern ideology of liberal individual humanism is also very, very similar. Judging the whole world and expecting the whole world to adopt liberal vision of human rights and everything like this. And so, well, what is the, just going a little bit further, so what is the biblical view of imperialism? This is the biblical view of imperialism. The Lord will say, "I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look of his eyes." Yeah, because he says, "By the strength of my hand, I've done this. By my wisdom, because I have understanding. I removed the boundaries of nations, created an empire. I plundered their treasures, exploited them. Like a mighty one, I've subdued their kings. As one reaches into a nest, so my hand reached for the wealth of the nations. As people gather abandoned eggs, so I gathered all the countries. Not one flapped a wing or opened its mouth to chirp." That's the biblical critique of imperialism. Not just the Assyrian Empire, but of all empires. They're wrong. It's not the way God wants things to be. And so when we look at the back of the story of Babel then, we can see it starts off with everybody was made to speak one language with one purpose. In other words, everybody, it was a totalitarian society that had been established. And we can see the elements of that totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is not a new thing. It's been there forever in these kind of fallen evil sovereignties, the kind of evil sovereignty that God wants to destroy and break to liberate people. So this then is from Jonathan Sacks, this is the way in which the story of Babel is interpreted from the point of view of political philosophy. So Genesis 10, that's about after the flood, describes a division of humanity into 70 nations and 70 languages. Genesis 11 tells how one imperial power conquered smaller nations and imposed their language and culture on them, thus directly contravening God's wish that humans should respect the integrity of each nation and each individual. When at the end of the Babel story, God confuses the language of the builders, he's not creating a new state of affairs, but restoring the old. Interpreted thus, the story of Babel is a critique of the power of the collective when it crushes individuality. The Babel story is a critique of imperialism. So we saw there, and the principle also talks about after the First World War, the defeated nations gave up their colonies. After the Second World War, the victors gave up their colonies. very kindly says voluntarily, but it actually wasn't like that. And then every nation then came to, anyway, many nations then, not quite everybody yet, many nations then found their own, fought sometimes for their independence, and they were admitted into the Brotherhood of Nations at the United Nations. And the principle then recognizes that's the way, that's God's providence. United Nations, many different nations, each having treated equally, each one being respected, each one having its own integrity, its own language, its own way of doing things, etc., etc. So you can see there the principle then is merely a new expression of the truth, which is what it claims to be. And the old truth, of course, is expressed in stories in the Bible. So to really understand and make sense of the principle, I always say you really have to understand and make sense of these stories in the Bible, because this is the wisdom which is, thousands of years old. So this is always the challenge then. How to have peace? Is it through creating an empire and making everybody conform to one language, one law, one culture, one this, one that? Or is it to have respect diversity and just to have common universal laws that everybody respects? The laws of Noah, but then these can also be expanded to, within international law to other laws as well. Okay, and so this is the vision then. The biblical vision about peace is between the nations. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, Mount Zion, where the temple of God is, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. These are the laws of Noah. The law will go out from Zion, the laws of Noah, universal laws about morality. The word of God from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and he will settle disputes for many peoples. They then in response, they will decide, oh, actually we should be living at peace with each other. Then they will beat their swords into plowshares voluntarily, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So again, it's not the elimination of nations, it's peace between the nations. That's always been the biblical vision of peace. It's not uniformity, but it's peace between mutual respect between the nations. And then we have this, of course, very famous bronze statue outside the United Nations, created by, actually donated by the Soviet Union. Based upon that, let us beat swords into plowshares. There are lots of problems in the United Nations that I want to talk about now. Basically, that's where I'm going to stop now. Okay, so I hope that was interesting. So thank you all very much for coming this evening, and I hope to see you tomorrow evening.